My ex-husband didn't believe that I was pregnant with his kid. He left and now, 15 years later, he is back trying to play dad. 15 years ago, I thought I had it all figured out. I was married to Tom, a man I genuinely believed was my soulmate. We'd been together for 3 years, and though we had our ups and downs, I thought we had a strong foundation. When I found out I was pregnant, I was scared, but excited. I imagined a future where we'd become a family, where this new life would bring us closer together. But everything fell apart the moment I told Tom I was pregnant. Instead of joy or even shock, Tom's reaction was outright denial. He didn't just doubt the pregnancy, he doubted me. He accused me of cheating and claimed the baby couldn't possibly be his. His reasoning? He said he couldn't have children. That revelation blindsided me because he'd never mentioned any fertility issues before. When I asked him why he thought that, he got defensive and said it didn't matter. To him, the only explanation for my pregnancy was infidelity. His accusations didn't stop there. He claimed I was having an affair with his younger brother, Don. I'll admit, I spent a lot of time around Don, but not for the reasons Tom imagined. Tom had a drinking problem that often spiraled out of control. He'd come home late, reeking of alcohol, sometimes picking fights or making reckless decisions. One time, he got into a car accident after drinking too much, and Don was the one who stepped in to help. Don wasn't just Tom's brother, he was my support system when Tom wasn't capable of being one. Tom twisted that into something ugly. He accused me of using him to pay for another man's child, tearing apart our marriage and his relationship with his brother. Don tried to reason with him, as did Tom's parents, but he wouldn't listen. He refused to believe that I hadn't betrayed him. It got to the point where Tom accused his brother of being a traitor and cut off all contact with his entire family. I begged him to trust me. I suggested we wait until the baby was born and do a paternity test, but Tom wasn't interested. He wanted a test done during the pregnancy, even though it wasn't safe. His paranoia and anger grew worse every day. He became cold, distant, and cruel. He stopped coming home most nights, and when he did, it was only to remind me that he knew I'd been unfaithful. By the time I was 3 months pregnant, Tom had filed for divorce. He told me he couldn't stay in a marriage where he had to raise someone else's kid. He walked away from me, from our unborn child, and from his family. After he left, I tried to keep tabs on him, partly out of concern and partly because I hoped he might change his mind. I didn't want him to hurt himself or spiral into something worse. I found out he was still frequenting his favorite bars, seemingly fine with his decision. I could have ended the pregnancy and moved on with my life, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I wanted my child to have a chance at life, even if it meant raising him alone. Tom's family, especially Don, stepped up to help me. My own family wasn't supportive. They were dysfunctional and emotionally abusive, but Don and his parents became my rock. When Jacob was born, he brought so much light into my life. He was a happy, healthy baby, and I poured everything I had into being a good mother. I sent Tom pictures and updates for the first couple of years, hoping he might have a change of heart. He never replied. He didn't show up for Jacob's birth, didn't acknowledge any milestones, and eventually, I stopped trying. Raising Jacob wasn't easy. I worked long hours to provide for him, often leaning on Don and his wife for support. Don became a father figure to Jacob, and Jacob grew up considering Don's kids his cousins. Despite the challenges, we built a happy, stable life. Jacob never asked about his father, and I decided I'd tell him the truth when he turned 16. Until then, I saw no reason to introduce unnecessary pain or confusion into his life. Now, Jacob is 15. Just a few months shy of his 16th birthday. He's a smart, talented teenager with a bright future ahead of him. He excels in school, has a tight-knit group of friends, and is passionate about music. I couldn't be prouder of the young man he's becoming. Then, out of nowhere, Tom resurfaced. After 15 years of silence, he found me on social media and sent me a long-winded message apologizing for how he treated me. He said he wanted to reconnect and, most importantly, meet Jacob. He claimed he regretted his actions and wanted to make things right. Reading his message filled me with a mix of emotions, anger, confusion, and a tiny sliver of doubt. Was he sincere, or was this just about easing his guilty conscience? Where had this regret been for the past 15 years? Why now? I reached out to Don for advice. He was livid. Don has always been protective of Jacob and sees Tom as a selfish, unreliable person. He believes Tom is only reaching out now because it serves his interests, not because he genuinely wants to be a father. Part of me agrees, but another part wonders if I should at least give him the chance to prove himself. Jacob doesn't know about any of this yet. I was planning to tell him about Tom on his 16th birthday, but now I feel like that decision is being forced on me. If I introduce Tom now, it could disrupt the stability and happiness Jacob has known his entire life. On the other hand, if I don't, am I denying him the opportunity to make his own decisions about his father? I'm torn. Tom's reappearance has brought back so many painful memories. I've spent the past 15 years trying to move on, to build a good life for Jacob without the shadow of Tom's betrayal hanging over us. Now it feels like all of that is being dragged back into the light. I don't know what to do. Should I let Tom meet Jacob, knowing the potential risks, or should I keep the door closed to protect my son from the hurt and disappointment Tom is likely to bring? Update 1. After receiving an overwhelming amount of advice and suggestions from all of you, I knew I had to make a decision quickly. I had already spent too much time thinking about what was best for Jacob and me. The most important thing was to be honest with him. I spent some time with Don before talking to Jacob, hashing out the details of everything that had happened. Tom's accusations, his disappearance, and his sudden reappearance after 15 years. Don was skeptical, just as I was, but he agreed that Jacob needed to hear it all from me. So, I sat down with Jacob one evening. He was in his room, listening to music, and I could tell something was weighing on his mind. He hadn't asked about his father, at least not directly, but I knew he was getting older and would soon start wondering about his biological father. I told him everything. The initial joy of finding out I was pregnant, Tom's shock and anger, the accusations that nearly destroyed my relationship with his family, and how Tom had decided to leave before Jacob was even born. I didn't sugarcoat anything. I told him that Tom's decision was his, and that it wasn't something I could control. Jacob didn't react in the way I expected. He wasn't angry right away, but it was clear that he was hurt. He asked questions about why Tom never reached out, and when I told him that I sent updates and pictures every year with no response, his face showed signs of confusion. It seemed like the idea that someone could just abandon a child was difficult for him to comprehend. As he processed what I said, he started to ask more specific questions about why Tom had come back into our lives now, 15 years later. He was curious, but not excited. I knew he had a lot of unanswered questions, and I understood that he felt conflicted. After thinking for a while, Jacob told me that he wanted to meet Tom, but he made it clear that he wasn't doing it because he wanted a relationship. He wanted answers. He wanted to know why Tom had left and why he hadn't done anything to fix it for so long. He was upset, but more than anything, he was curious about why this man suddenly felt the need to reach out after so many years. I agreed to arrange a meeting, but I wasn't going to let Jacob go into this blind. I knew I needed to see where Tom's head was at, especially after hearing from all of you and knowing that his reasons for coming back were more than questionable. I arranged to meet Tom first, and Don was going to join me. I knew Tom hadn't changed much since we last saw each other, but I wanted to see how he was holding up. When Tom showed up, he looked different, older, like the years had taken a toll on him. He wasn't the confident man I remembered, and I almost didn't recognize him at first. He had this nervous energy about him that I hadn't seen before. He avoided eye contact and seemed like he didn't quite know how to start the conversation. At first, all he could do was apologize. He said he regretted leaving, but I could tell he was just going through the motions. There was no real depth to what he was saying. He told me that back when I was pregnant, he had panicked. He said he wasn't ready to be a father and didn't want the responsibility. He admitted he had made a mistake by accusing me of cheating with Don. He said he was afraid of being trapped and that he didn't know how to handle the situation. He kept saying how sorry he was for abandoning us, but I couldn't help but wonder, why now? Why after all this time? Don wasn't interested in hearing Tom's excuses. He interrupted him several times, pointing out how ridiculous and selfish Tom had been and how he had caused so much unnecessary pain. Even Tom seemed embarrassed by the way Don was calling him out, but there was no apology that would ever make up for what he'd done. It was clear that he was trying to justify his actions to make himself feel better, but Don and I weren't buying it. Despite everything, I knew I had to let Jacob make the call on how he wanted to proceed. After some discussion, we agreed that Jacob should meet Tom, but I didn't want to leave anything to chance. I set up a second meeting, one that would be in a public, neutral location. Don and I would be there the entire time, and I told Tom to keep his expectations low. This wasn't about some father-son reunion, This was about Jacob getting the answers he deserved and nothing more. The day of the meeting came, and Jacob wasn't exactly thrilled about it. I could tell he was conflicted, but he wanted to do this. When we arrived at the location, Tom was already there, looking more nervous than before. He tried to approach Jacob with open arms, but Don quickly stepped in, telling him that was too much, too soon. Tom looked flustered but didn't argue. Jacob didn't waste any time. The first thing he asked Tom was why he left. He didn't sugarcoat anything and went straight for the heart of the matter. Tom stammered through his explanation, offering the same excuses he had given me about fear and immaturity. When Jacob asked why Tom had never responded to the updates I sent, Tom froze. His eyes widened, and he didn't have an answer. He stammered that he hadn't been ready to face what he had done, but Jacob wasn't buying it. Then Jacob dropped the question that seemed to hit hardest. Why had Tom waited so long to come back? Tom's response was weak at best. He said he regretted leaving and wished he had come back sooner, but his fear had kept him away. Jacob didn't respond right away, but just shook his head. He wasn't interested in hearing Tom's excuses. At that moment, I saw Jacob's frustration grow. He wasn't angry in the way I expected. He didn't yell or cry. He just seemed disappointed. He didn't need a father, especially one who had only come back to ease his own guilt. Tom tried to hug him, but Don quickly stepped in, saying that wasn't going to happen. It was clear Tom wasn't ready to accept the reality of the situation. Jacob left the meeting early and went to the car. His disappointment was clear. He didn't want to waste any more time on someone who had abandoned him. I thought that would be the end of it. But a few days later, Tom reached out again, asking for another chance. He claimed he wanted to make things right and prove that he was ready to be a father. At this point, I'm not sure what the right decision is. All I know is that I have to do what's best for Jacob, even if it means keeping Tom out of our lives for good. Update 2. Well, I never would have seen this coming, so Tom wants my son's kidney. Don wasn't so sure, and he began to dig into Tom's life, trying to understand his sudden return. What he found wasn't promising. It turned out Tom had been dealing with some serious health issues, including kidney failure, and had been looking for a donor. When Don confronted him about it, Tom denied that his health problems were the reason he had come back, but it didn't sit right with any of us. It seemed like a desperate attempt to fix things on his terms. Things quickly escalated. After Don confronted Tom about his health, it was one thing to make excuses about his past actions, but to then have Don bring up the fact that Tom was dealing with kidney failure? That changed everything. I had already started to feel uneasy about Tom's motives, and now I had the proof that something wasn't right. Don took matters into his own hands. After hearing about Tom's hospitalization for kidney failure, he reached out to some mutual acquaintances and did some digging. What we found out sent a chill down my spine. Tom had been trying to find a kidney donor, and from what I could gather, he had been struggling with his health for months. He'd been on the waiting list for a transplant and had been desperately looking for a match. The fact that Tom was willing to come back now, after all these years of silence, only made sense if he was hoping that Jacob could be the donor. I couldn't believe it. I had hoped for years that he would come to his senses and make amends, but I never imagined this was his plan all along. When I confronted him, he swore up and down that he wasn't using Jacob. He said he wanted to reconnect and build a relationship with him, but I didn't believe it. Meanwhile, Don wasn't buying it either. He was livid, and rightfully so. It wasn't just about the kidney. It was about everything that had happened over the years. The abandonment, the lies, and now the sudden return with a possible ulterior motive. Don wasn't just angry at Tom for the years of neglect. He was furious that Tom thought we were gullible enough to believe his sudden change of heart. Then came the next bombshell. Don, still digging into Tom's life, uncovered something even more shocking. Tom had another child, a 12-year-old daughter named Lila. He had been hiding the fact that he had fathered another child during all these years, and he hadn't told anyone about her. This revelation was a slap in the face to me and Jacob, but it also made everything clearer. Tom had completely cut ties with his family for a reason. He was busy building another family while conveniently ignoring the one he had left behind. When Don and I confronted Tom about Lila, he claimed that he hadn't told us because he didn't want to complicate things. That was a lie, of course. We both knew it. Tom didn't want to admit that he had moved on, and that he had started a new life while abandoning the one he had left behind. He hadn't even bothered to keep in touch with his daughter. His neglect wasn't limited to just Jacob. It seemed to be a pattern. I wasn't the only one angry. Don was beside himself. He couldn't believe that Tom would hide something like that, especially after everything that had happened. He accused Tom of only coming back now to manipulate the situation. Tom tried to brush it off, but it was clear to all of us that he wasn't just trying to reconnect with Jacob, he was trying to cover up the fact that he was a terrible father to both of his children. The situation only got worse when Lila's mother reached out to me. She contacted me privately, warning me about Tom's behavior with their daughter. Apparently, he had been almost completely absent from Lila's life, showing up only when it was convenient for him. She told me that Tom had a pattern of disappearing whenever things got tough, and she urged me not to let Jacob get too close to him. I was livid. The more I found out about Tom, the more disgusted I became. He had abandoned both of his children and had been neglecting them for years, all while trying to make himself out to be some victim in this situation. His actions were so manipulative that I couldn't see how anyone could fall for them. Tom had spent 15 years running from responsibility, and now that he needed something, he thought he could just waltz back into our lives. Jacob, after hearing about the situation with Lila and learning the truth about Tom's lack of involvement in her life, made his decision. He didn't want anything to do with him. There was no forgiveness in his heart for a man who had only shown up when it was convenient for him. As much as Jacob wanted answers, he didn't need a father who had spent 15 years being absent. He had learned to live without Tom, and that's how he wanted it to stay. Don and I were on the same page. We didn't trust Tom. He hadn't earned the right to be in Jacob's life, and it was clear that his sudden reappearance wasn't about mending a relationship. It was about what he could take for his benefit, a whole damn kidney. We didn't want any part of it. Tom wasn't done yet though. After Jacob rejected him, he started sending messages, pleading for another chance. He claimed that he wanted to prove he could be a good father, and that he was ready to make up for all the years he had missed. But his timing couldn't have been worse. We were all seeing through his act. It wasn't about building a relationship with Jacob. It was about trying to make himself feel better for his own mistakes. Then, Tom made the biggest mistake of all. He called me to demand that I let him see Jacob, threatening legal action if I didn't comply. He said he had a right to be in his son's life, and that if I didn't allow him to reconnect, he would fight me in court. Tom finally admitted that his true reason for reaching out was to find a kidney donor, which was insane. He didn't even try to mask his intentions, stating bluntly that he had been struggling with kidney failure and needed a transplant. It was as though everything we had gone through, the betrayal, the pain, the years of silence, was reduced to a cold, calculated plea for his son's body. It was beyond heart-wrenching. Tom didn't care about rebuilding the relationship or even about Jacob's well-being. He saw him as nothing more than a means to save himself. That revelation was the final straw, confirming every suspicion we'd had all along about his motives. The audacity of this man, after everything he had put us through, was unbelievable. I didn't respond immediately. I was seething, but I kept my calm. Don, on the other hand, was ready to go to war. He told Tom to bring it on, that we'd see him in court. So now we're preparing for a legal battle. Tom is making threats, but he's got no leg to stand on. I'm ready to fight for Jacob, and Don is more than willing to help. The only thing I know for sure is that we won't let Tom manipulate us into letting him back into our lives. If anything, I'm just relieved that Jacob has made his decision. He doesn't want Tom around, and I'll do whatever it takes to make sure he stays out of our lives. Right now, we're just waiting for the next move. Tom's threats of legal action are serious, but I'm not afraid. We have the law on our side, and I'm ready to face whatever comes next. All I want is to protect Jacob from a man who has only ever caused him pain. We're done with Tom and his bees. Final update. True to his word, Tom filed for visitation rights. The court battle was a nightmare. Tom's lawyer tried to paint him as a changed man, someone who had made mistakes but was now seeking to make amends. They argued that he regretted leaving Jacob and was ready to be a father, but we weren't convinced. His sudden reappearance after 15 years made it clear that his motives weren't purely about reconciliation. My lawyer presented a strong case, emphasizing Tom's complete abandonment of Jacob and the lack of any effort to build a relationship. It didn't help Tom's case when his financial troubles came to light. He had significant debt due to gambling, and he had failed to pay child support for his daughter, Lila. His neglect toward her and the financial mess he had created painted a clear picture of a man who wasn't seeking a relationship but a solution to his own problems. The trial uncovered that Tom's health issues, particularly his kidney failure, were part of why he had reached out. It became clear that he was searching for a donor, and Jacob was his best option. That reality made his desire to reconnect even harder to believe. Tom's reappearance wasn't driven by love or guilt, it was driven by necessity. The judge ruled in our favor. Tom was denied visitation rights, but the court did allow him to send letters, which Jacob could choose to read or ignore. It was a small concession, but at least it gave Jacob some control over the situation. I wasn't sure how Jacob would respond to Tom's letters, but I respected his choice. After the trial, Tom sent me a letter blaming me for poisoning Jacob against him. He tried to turn the blame on me, but I didn't engage. Jacob had made his choice, and that was enough for me. Tom had abandoned us for years, and now his words carried no weight. Jacob continued to focus on his life. He didn't seem bothered by the court case or Tom's absence. He was doing well in school, spending time with his friends, and looking ahead to the future. He didn't harbor any hatred for Tom, but he also didn't feel the need to have a relationship with him. His decision was clear. Tom had made his choice years ago, and now Jacob was making his own. Don, who had always been there for us, stayed in touch throughout the ordeal. He wasn't surprised by Tom's behavior and was still furious. He even suggested we get a restraining order, just in case Tom tried to interfere. We filed for one, but I didn't expect Tom to reach out again. The silence that followed the trial was a relief. Tom didn't make any more attempts to contact us. I didn't know if he had gotten the message or if he simply felt too embarrassed to try again. Either way, I felt no need to dwell on it. This nightmare with him was closed, and I felt a sense of relief, not from anger or frustration, but from the weight of his presence finally being gone. Jacob and I had moved on, and we didn't need him to be part of our lives. I didn't need Tom to make things right. I had raised Jacob, and we had created a life for ourselves. Tom's absence didn't change that. In the end, Jacob had found the family he needed, the one that had always been there for him. Tom was a distant memory, a man who had never cared enough to show up when it mattered and only showed up for his own purposes when it benefited him. Jacob has everything he needs. He is strong, loved, and supported. Tom had made his choices, and so had we. It is over, and I am at peace knowing I have done everything I can to give Jacob the best life possible. Thank you for the support, Reddit.